at least in the US, and from a nutritional point of view, we view DDGS as primarily an energy source and secondarily a protein source. I know many people have those reversed. They think of DDGS as being primarily a protein source and secondarily an energy source. In fact, in the US, I'm going to pick beef cattle feedlots as an example. Those feedlot managers are putting in 40% of dry matter intake as often wet distillers grains, and in putting that high inclusion rate in that total diet, they're feeding DDGS as primarily an energy source, and they're feeding excess protein and excess phosphorus. So they're wasting protein and phosphorus because of the high energy value of DDGS. And we'll talk about some details here in a moment. Another really attractive feature about DDGS compared to corn and other grains, and this is important for species like pigs and poultry, that it's very high in digestible phosphorus, or a high proportion of the phosphorus in DDGS is very digestible, and that allows us to reduce the amount of inorganic phosphate that we add to these diets as a supplement. And by the way, those inorganic phosphates are quite expensive. So it's phosphorus is the third most expensive nutrient that we have in animal feeds, followed by protein and amino acids being second, and energy being the most expensive. So in general, DDGS is no different than any other feed ingredient. It's got some strengths, which we're going to talk about, and some weaknesses, but we manage all those things and we put it together in the right proportions with other ingredients, and so we can meet the animal's needs, nutritional needs. The positives, it's high in energy. A lot of that energy is coming from fat or oil. I know that Pannonia Gold, or Pannonia, is going to be extracting oil, and so you'll see a lower oil DDGS, much like you would find in the US now, and we can talk about some of those details in a moment. Fiber is very attractive going into cattle feeds. In fact, a good friend of mine, Dr. Galen Erickson, who's a beef cattle nutritionist at the University of Nebraska, was asked a question at a conference that I was at as well. And the question was, well, Dr. Erickson, if the ethanol industry starts taking oil out of DDGS, is that a concern for you in beef cattle feedlots, because we know that you're feeding DDGS primarily as an energy source, and we know that oil's high in energy? And he said, you know, not really. He said, and this is the quote, "You can take away the oil, but don't take away my fiber." And if you think about that, one of the attractive features of wet or dried distillers grains for dairy cows and beef cattle is that it's a safer energy source. What do I mean by safer? In the US, when we're fattening beef cattle before harvest or slaughter, our goal is to get as much energy into them as we can. One way to do that is to feed a lot of corn. Corn's really high in energy. But corn also has a lot of starch, and those rumen microbes go crazy. It's like going into a candy store, and they get sick, and it causes what we call acidosis, rumen acidosis, if we're feeding high corn diets. So the beef cattle guys that like to feed lots of energy say, oh, no, I want to feed DDGS because that carbohydrate, that fiber, ferments slower. And so those rumen microbes don't get sick, and so there's less risk of acidosis. It's a really, really nice feature. We generally consider DDGS to be a moderate protein source, but it's not particularly a good protein quality source. What do I mean by that? Protein quality really only is an issue for pigs and poultry. And what I mean by protein quality, it's the proportion of essential amino acids relative to the animal's requirement. Corn and any corn co-product has a relatively low amount of lysine compared to its total protein content. And that relationship gets worse in DDGS compared to corn. Doesn't mean it's bad, it just means that we have to find lysine from other ingredients like soybean meal or crystalline amino acids or other protein sources. I've already talked about phosphorus being highly digestible for pigs and poultry. That's another nice feature. And xanthophyll content. Does everybody know what xanthophylls are? It's the yellow pigment. I work with some layers and broiler companies in countries like Taiwan and China and even Mexico for that matter. And one of the things that they like about DDGS and corn co-products in general is that they can reduce or eliminate some of the synthetic pigment they put in their broiler and layer diets, which they're using for darker egg yolk color and darker skin color, which is important in many countries. And so DDGS provides some of those xanthophylls and allows some partial replacement of that synthetic pigment, which is very expensive. And we've conducted studies, and if any of you are interested, I can share those with you. So that's another value-added feature of DDGS. The xanthophyll content, by the way, I often get asked this question, is about 40 ppm, 40 milligrams per kilogram. How many of you have had experience with corn gluten meal? Any? Yeah. Corn gluten meal is even higher. It's about 200 to 250 milligrams per kilogram. So that's a better source of xanthophyll, but certainly we get a fair bit of it from DDGS. So what are the negative attributes? And it varies depending on what species we talk about. In non-ruminants, the high fiber content is a bit of an issue, but don't forget that some of that fiber is fermentable and contributes to the energy value of DDGS. Not all fiber is bad. I've already talked about poor protein quality or the amino acid balance not being as perfect as we would like, and that's why we use other supplements to make up for that difference. Amino acid digestibility can vary. We were having a conversation last night about color of DDGS, and does that have any relationship with amino acid digestibility? So I want to do a short survey here. How many of you think that dark colored DDGS is a guarantee that the amino acid digestibility is bad? Anybody? How many think it's good? How many say, I don't know or I don't care? Okay. Very simply, and we could get into a whole discussion on this as well, color of DDGS is a poor indicator or not a very good predictor of amino acid digestibility. At least with most of the technology that's being used in ethanol plants today. Certainly for Pannonia Gold, it's not an issue. It's golden color, we like that, amino acid digestibility is high. It's only if you get really dark colored DDGS or other feed ingredients, the color of coffee grounds, that you have to really be worried. High sulfur content, I talked about that as a risk factor for cattle this morning. Remember why? Because if the total diet and water consumption exceeds 0.4% of the total diet, we have a risk of polio and encephalomalacia. So as long as the total diet content is low, which generally it is, but sometimes when we're feeding, as we do in the US, high amounts of wet distillers grains to beef cattle, and if that source is high in sulfur, and if the water is high and so on and so forth, it is a risk factor. But generally, for most of us, we don't worry about and sodium content. So how many of you knew that DDGS, or wet distillers grains, has more energy than corn for cattle? Well, it does. And that's why I call it an energy source. And if you follow it from a market perspective, DDGS price follows the corn price much more closely than it does soybean meal. Now that's changing a little bit in the US because 85% of the ethanol industry is now extracting some oil. So it's making DDGS more like soybean meal. It's still not the same, but a little bit more like soybean meal and a little bit less like corn. But DDGS price is still going to follow corn price. For swine, DDGS contains about the same energy as corn. which makes it very attractive. And for poultry, it's about 85% the energy value of corn. So if I have a feed mill,
Does that vary depending on the age of the swine?
um,
Or is it just a different mill?
good question. Does that depend on the age of the pig? Generally speaking, slightly. If I'm feeding a pregnant sow who has a more developed lower digestive system that can manage fiber better, she'll get a little bit more energy value than if I have a baby pig that has a less developed digestive system. Small differences, I'm generalizing here, kind of big picture things, but you're right. I mean, it's going to vary a little bit by age of the animal and by species. The biggest thing here is if DDGS becomes priced too high, which are the first diets that it's not going to be used of these choices? Dairy, beef, pigs, or poultry?
Probably written.
No.
Well, it depends on what country you live in.
Probably depends on, good point. Good point. Probably depends on what country you live in. But generally speaking, because of its high energy value, the protein is not an issue for cattle. It's always going to be worth more in dairy and beef diets than pig and poultry. And generally speaking, because of its lower energy value, at least based on US diets and the way we think of this ingredient, the first place it's going to drop out if it gets too expensive is in poultry diets, because it has less energy value of corn. So if it's more expensive and I have the choice of using corn, I'm going to use corn for poultry. There are lots of reviews. And by the way, I didn't include a slide, and my apologies, I normally do this. But we have a University of Minnesota DDGS website that I'd encourage you to visit. If you'd like lots of information, summaries of all the research that's been done on this ingredient, you can find it at that website. And I'll give it to you very briefly if you want to jot it down quickly. www.DDGS, what a surprise, .UMN, U Mary Nancy, University of Minnesota, .edu. www.ddgs.umn.edu. And there you can find all these summaries and way more information than you ever wanted to know about DDGS. So very quickly, one of the things that you need to know if you don't already is that because we produce a lot of DDGS in the US, most of the DDGS is fed to animals in the US. This year, I think the US ethanol industry is going to export close to 9 million metric tons of DDGS to other countries. The primary export market is Canada, Mexico, and China. And as I travel to those different countries, people are amazed, how can you feed such high levels of this ingredient to all these species? In the US, it's not uncommon, in fact, it's very common, for growing finishing pigs to feed 30 to 40% DDGS diets. Does that happen here in Europe? I haven't seen any. Does it happen in Asia? No. Does it happen in Mexico? No. A little bit in Canada. How do we make that happen? We make it happen because we have high confidence in the energy content or ways of knowing what the energy value is, and we formulate diets on a digestible amino acid basis and a digestible phosphorus basis. And by doing that and having confidence in our nutrient values of the sources that we're using, we can include very high inclusion rates, save a lot of money for pig farmers, and everybody's happy, except, remember that other limiting factor, that risk factor I talked about first thing this morning, the high corn oil? Our packing industry has not been very happy about farmers using DDGS because of its impact on belly quality, pork fat quality, and so on. So they put downward pressure on pig farmers saying, don't use so much, because the more you use, the softer the belly gets. That's changing a little bit now because, again, much of the US ethanol industry, like Pannonia, is going to be taking some of the oil out. And so that has less of a negative impact on performance. So 30 to 40% DDGS in growing finishing pig diets. We actually feed it to nursery pigs right at weaning, if you can believe it. Most people say, no, can't do that, it's too risky. We've conducted, and these are summaries that Dr. Hans Stein at the University of Illinois and I put together a few years ago. There have been more conducted since this summary was put together, but notice none of the studies showed a reduction in average daily gain by using up to 30% DDGS in diets for weaned pigs. Most of them showed no change compared to our conventional diets, commercial diets that are fed. And in a couple cases, our feed conversion got better. Gain per feed or gain efficiency improved. Most of it's used in the grow-finish phase of pig production in the US. This is a typical diet. I don't have time to get into those details. Again, we would expect, compared to conventional diets without DDGS, no change in performance, even up to 30 or 40% of the diet. I don't have time to get into all these details because I want to talk a little on all species, but just to summarize the effects on carcass characteristics. So you already know that pork fat quality can be an issue if we feed really high levels. Generally, at less than 20% of the diet, we don't have any issues for most markets with pork fat quality and feeding DDGS. However, as we feed increasing levels, another thing happens. DDGS, of course, is fairly high in fiber, and so the dressing percentage will tend to decline a little bit. Carcass yield. Everybody knows what carcass yield is, right? The weight of the carcass divided by the live weight, so that yield tends to decrease, and what that means, depending on the country and the market and the pricing system, it may cause some adjustments of feeding the pigs a little bit longer to get them to a heavier live weight to compensate for that, or sometimes it just doesn't matter. Again, it depends on the country. No effect on the quality of the muscle or the meat. I mean, slight differences in color, but nothing of any significance or consumer acceptability. Certainly health and safety is not an issue. And so pork fat quality is the predominant thing that we have to manage in feeding this to pigs. Here's an example, just to give you a visual. On the left, in the US, we feed our corn, soybean meal-based diets, and that's the firmness of the belly from a pig that was harvested on the left. On the right, if we feed a 30% high oil DDGS diet for the entire grow-finish period, the belly becomes pretty soft. Sometimes, depending on the market, that's a concern. Sometimes it's not. In the US, it has been an issue. But we can manage it in a number of ways. I won't have time to get into those details. We've got some evidence that there's a value-added feature of DDGS when you feed it to growing finishing pigs. And we have published research on this, but there's a condition called ileitis. It's a gut health problem in pigs. It's caused by an organism called Lawsonia intracellularis. I'm sure you have it fairly frequently on pig farms in Europe. We found that putting 10% DDGS in these diets actually reduces the severity of the lesions caused by this disease in the intestinal tract, the length of the lesion, which is a good thing, and the prevalence of lesions. So here's an example of a feed ingredient, we think because of the yeast that it contains and some of the other fermentation compounds that are produced during ethanol production, that is contributing to some improvements in gut health. There's similar evidence in poultry, and I've been involved in some collaborations on some aquaculture and fish research showing some evidence as well. So we don't plan for these, but it might be an added benefit that we get sometimes. We also feed it to sows, both in gestation and lactation. 50% DDGS diets in gestation, up to 30% in lactation, works very, very well. So again, I know these are inclusion rates that sound scary to many of you, but we have commercial farms that have been doing this for at least the last 10 years with good success. Poultry diets, I've already talked about some of these things. Energy value, talked about sodium, protein quality, xanthophyll. I think we've got those covered. Here's an example of a study that was published in broilers a couple of years ago. They fed 0, 8, 16, and 24% DDGS diets. These would be from 0 to 42 days of age for these broilers. And notice that even at the 24% inclusion rate for DDGS, which is higher than what our commercial industry in the US will do, if you think about companies like Tyson or Pilgrim's Pride and some others, most of them are using somewhere between 8 to 10, maybe 12% DDGS in their diets for broilers. So none of them are feeding at 16 or 24%. The point of putting this up here is that if you formulate the diets correctly and have good knowledge about digestible amino acid content, you can, and in fact, achieve equal performance in terms of body weight gain, feed intake, or feed conversion at much higher inclusion rates. And notice that mortality was not significantly affected. Numerically, it's actually better for the DDGS diets compared to the control. So this is one example. Yeah.
Maybe get into it, maybe get into it. Did you have any effect, negative or positive effect on broiler litter, and therefore the damage to hot burns, breast blisters, periodontitis, whatever?
It's a good question. Let me repeat it. In that study, or do we see in general issues with wet litter or breast bruises or other things? Not specifically related to DDGS. As I mentioned earlier, if we have high sodium content in a DDGS source, which happens sometimes, and we don't take some salt out of the diet to compensate for that, we can get wet litter in that situation. But most of the time, it's not a concern.
Why do you get sodium contents DDGS?
I'm sorry.
How do you get high sodiums in DDGS? What's the
I'm trying to think about this. What do you know about the I think some sodium hydroxide is used as a pH adjuster. And so you'll have some residual sodium because pH, of course, of the fermentation is very important to keep those yeasts doing their job. I think that's where most of it. And so depending on the extent of that need, you'll find occasionally higher amounts. It's a good question. Again, like in pigs, we don't see any effects, negative effects, or even positive effects on carcass characteristics. These are the results from that same performance study I just showed you. Fat pattern weight has not changed. Chilled carcass weight, breast meat weight or yield, leg weight and yield, wing weight, none of those were affected even at high inclusion rates. Some for layers, here's an example, performance 21 to 26 week-old laying hens, fed diets 0, 10, and 20% DDGS. You can see the numbers. There's essentially no difference in those parameters, feeding as much as 20% DDGS. Again, our laying industry in the US does not feed high levels like 20%. It's most common for them to use 10% DDGS. And certainly in doing so, you get very nice performance. So for broilers and layers, 10% is fairly easy, fairly standard. You can go to higher inclusion rates if you choose, if the price relationship is right, as well, as long as you make adjustments on some of the amino acids, have good, accurate nutrient loading values, and some energy adjustments. Dairy rations. We've talked about many of these already. Generally, we're feeding it as an energy source to replace some of the corn in a dairy ration, but it also provides a fair bit of protein. Our biggest concern in dairy cattle feeds is the oil content of DDGS and the unsaturated fatty acids that are found in corn oil. most of you know or have experience with dairy cows that if we put too much fat in the diet, we'll depress butter fat or milk fat content. So that's been a risk factor that our dairy producers have worried about with DDGS. The good news is that as the ethanol industry takes some of that oil out, there's less oil in DDGS, and so theoretically we could have higher inclusion rates without risk of milk fat depression. Excuse me. I think we've talked about most of these. Typically, at the levels that are being fed, most of our dairies are feeding, they're fairly conservative. They could feed higher amounts. Data would indicate they could feed up to 30% of dry matter intake as wet or dry distillers. But most of them are staying around 10% because of the oil content issue. Dr. David Shingathy, who's a colleague of mine that is at South Dakota State University, our neighboring state, has just retired, but he did a nice summary of 24 different research trials with 100 treatment comparisons for a fairly long period of time. DDGS, or wet distillers grains, has been used for decades in the US in cattle feeds, both beef and dairy. We know the most about it in cattle. And so this is a summary of different percentages of dry matter intake of DDGS all the way up to more than 30%. And notice that if you look at dry matter intake, milk yield, really no effects with high inclusion rates unless you get over 30%. If we look at fat content or protein content of the milk, only when we get to over 30% dietary inclusion do we see a depression in protein. In this case, a summary of all these studies didn't even show a depression in milk fat, but it's still a risk factor that many people are concerned about. So it's common to feed 10%. Sometimes some dairies are using 20%, equivalent to about 4.5 to 6 kilograms per cow per day for high-producing dairy cows. If it gets higher than that, we do have some risks, but I'm sure throughout all of Europe here, those inclusion rates are much higher than what are actually being used. Beef cattle, wet distillers grains actually has more energy than dried distillers grains. That's why many of our beef feedlots are located next to ethanol plants. And I know of a few ethanol plants that don't even have dryers. So all the product that they're producing is wet and it's going directly to local cattle feeders, big feedlots. And those feedlots love this ingredient because in the case of wet distillers grains, it's got as much as 150% the energy value of corn. So it's a great energy source. And it's one of the reasons why they'll include high amounts as a corn replacement in these feedlot diets. We've talked about the limitations already. I didn't mention that because of the high phosphorus content in corn and DDGS relative to the calcium content, we do need to provide calcium supplements to keep the calcium to phosphorus ratio in line with the animal needs. Otherwise, we can have issues called urinary calculi and so on, but as long as we're conscious of that in formulating diets, it's not a major issue. Again, I can show you summaries of studies. These happen to be some from Dr. Terry Kloffenstein, researcher at the University of Nebraska. Summary of 5 experiments showing up to 40% DDGS inclusion for finishing steers, no effect on dry matter intake. Average daily gain actually gets better as the inclusion rate for DDGS increases. Feed conversion doesn't change. And if you calculate the feeding value, which is relative to corn using DDGS, and it's calculated by the difference of gain efficiency or gain per feed divided by DDGS inclusion rate, the feeding value relative to corn is actually the highest at a low inclusion rate, that'd be 10%, still higher than corn at 20, still higher at 30, and at 40% dietary inclusion rates about equal to corn. Again, because of this higher energy value giving us feed efficiency improvements going into these feedlot cattle. Carcass grade, carcass yield, all those carcass characteristics are not affected by feeding DDGS. These are the ribeye muscle, marbling score, the amount of fat in the muscle, not affected. And here's an example. I do want to touch on wet distillers grains because Pannonia is going to be producing that, and it'll be a very valuable and important ingredient in the local cattle feed market. Here's an example of a wet distillers grains diet that we would feed in the US. And it would contain somewhere around 60% dry rolled corn generally, or sometimes high moisture corn, depending on the farm. 30% wet distillers grains with solubles. So you can see this diet is already 90% of the dry matter as corn or corn-based products, a little bit of alfalfa hay, some dry supplement, which is the vitamins, minerals, and other things that we might put in for additives. So it's predominantly a corn-based diet or corn co-product-based diet with a little bit of alfalfa hay as forage to keep the rumen working. So this would be a very typical wet distiller's diet for feedlot cattle. For beef, cows, and heifers, these are some examples. DDGS is a really nice supplement. Actually, it's too rich in energy and nutrients certainly for brood cows or pregnant cows out on pasture, because they don't need very much, or dry cows. Growing heifers, here's some examples. These are in English units, not metric units, but you get the rough idea that it has applications in all these diets, and depending on what the nutrient needs are of the particular stage of growth. You can use it in sheep and goat diets. It's probably not a real common thing here in Europe. Certainly isn't in the US, but it works equally well. And the same rules, the same limitations, the same benefits that I talked about for dairy and beef cattle apply for sheep and goats, which shouldn't be a surprise to most of you. We can feed very high levels. Here's an example of an experiment feeding up to 60% DDGS to finishing lamb rations. Notice that growth rate, feed conversion, and so on were unaffected, even at that very high inclusion rate. Carcass characteristics, generally not affected. Lactating ewes, of course. And we're finding, at least in the US, and I know I've worked with Steve a little bit on interest with Pannonia Gold going into aquaculture feeds throughout some markets in Europe, that the aquaculture industry is really embracing this ingredient, particularly for many of the species like tilapia, some freshwater prawns, saltwater prawns, lots of different applications. Southeast Asia, Vietnam imports a lot of US DDGS, and one of the predominant uses of what's imported is going into the aquaculture industry. And if you've never been to Vietnam, it's a fascinating place relative to the aquaculture production, and they're using DDGS at fairly high inclusion rates very successfully. We don't have as much knowledge about its feeding applications, but these are some summaries of studies that have been done with catfish, trout, salmon, shrimp, tilapia. And notice that inclusion rates are more than 10%, or in some cases up to 10%, particularly for the carnivorous fish like salmon and trout. If anybody's interested, we just finished a study that's been published in the Aquaculture Journal. I have collaborations with a good friend of mine, Dr. Overland at the Norwegian Life Sciences University, and we fed high amounts of DDGS to rainbow trout and found actually positive responses in performance compared to other vegetable-based ingredients in those diets. So I know probably most of you don't work in this area, but this is more for your awareness than anything else. So that's a quick review. I apologize for going so quickly, but there is a lot that we need to talk about. Let me ask, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Have you seen any difference between different sources of DDGS, different factors, the ADM or the
Yes. Excellent question. In the US, there are about 214 or 210, some number, a little bit more than 200 ethanol plants. There are basically 3 engineering designs of ethanol factories: ICM Fagan, which is Pannonia, Poet, ADM, and then there's another design that's not very common anymore, Delta T. Each of those engineering designs and processes do alter or change the composition of DDGS. I can tell you that among all these different sources, the variability in DDGS compared to other ingredients is quite high, partly because there are many factors that cause variation in nutrient content. Are they extracting oil? How much oil are they extracting? What enzymes are they using? What engineering process are they using? So variability is a challenge with DDGS. One advantage you have here in Europe is you've got a single source of DDGS, and the consistency of nutrient content is going to be quite good over the long haul compared to shopping among all these 200 and some plants of different designs, and you never know what you're going to get as you're getting it imported. So there is some variability among different sources.
Jerry, jump in and just say
Please.
two things. If you can't hear me, I'll try to speak loud. There's 2 other things that I think are important, at least from a Pannonia Gold perspective, on these comments. First, our senior management has made the decision that our co-product is not a co-product. DDGS is every bit as important as ethanol. So we run the plant. Yeah, the translator can't hear me, I'm sorry. I don't have a microphone. Sorry. Let me start again. Sorry about that. Let me repeat what I was just saying, though, to your question there, David. In terms of the variability, one of the things that can make a product be different between plant and plant is how you run your factory. Are you running it primarily for ethanol yields or whatnot? And if you decide to change that, our management has made a decision to consistently produce high-quality animal feed, every bit as important to us as a company as the ethanol. We can share with you audited information that will show you the consistent nutritional profile we've had over since the plant's opened up. And for those of you who take bigger shipments, like our friends here, one of the things that we're beneficial of goes back to this single source issue. When you buy a 50,000-ton Panamax out of New Orleans, it might be coming off of 5, 6, 7 different facilities. They get loaded, and you can even have layers of varying quality in that hold. That's something you won't see happening with us. Sorry, Jay.
Oh, good comments. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, okay. You talked about removing some more of the oil from your product. For those of us who are currently using it, we roughly know what the analysis of the product is. So can you give us an indication of what the new analysis is going to be? And how much the oil is going to go down, and consequently you assume that protein will go up then? Do you want to repeat this?
I'll repeat the question was, I made the comment that the U.S. ethanol industry, most of them, are removing some oil. What's the composition, or how does the composition change? Here's an example. I want to make a couple key points. Theoretically, if you take something out of an ingredient, everything else should increase by some proportion. However, because we've got so much variability, which goes to our previous question, so much variability in nutrient content and process, you can't rely on that relationship. So here's an example where normal DDGS in the US and Pannonia would be in the 10 to 12% crude fat range. However, the first stage of oil extraction in the US has led to DDGS being in the 7 to 8% oil content. So those of you that are importing US DDGS probably see specs like that fairly commonly. We have at least one ethanol company called Poet. They have 23 or 4 ethanol plants. And they're actually extracting the most oil of all ethanol companies, and their oil content would be 4.5 to 5% oil. These are actual samples of high, medium, and low oil DDGS that were produced by 3 different ethanol companies. So to answer the question, what happened to protein? Did it linearly increase or decrease as we go across? Protein of the high is 28.9, medium 28.3, low 27.5. I took oil out here. Isn't my protein supposed to go up? But it doesn't necessarily. Sometimes it does. So that's what's difficult or confusing in the market, is that people assume that the protein goes up when the oil goes down. And it's one of the biggest things, and some of you heard me make this comment on the bus last night. It's why we have to get away from pro-fat in our marketing specs or trading. Because that relationship, first of all, doesn't mean anything from a nutritional value point of view. And secondly, pro-fat specs, if anything, end up going down, like in this example. If you look at these numbers, did anything increase as the oil was taken out? Lysine didn't. Fiber actually, between medium and low, was about the same. Phosphorus content kind of bounced around. The point is, you really have to do a chemical analysis of the sources that you're using to get the accurate profiles. You can't predict it with protein or fat. Steve?
The change occurred a little less than a month ago, so it's still pretty new. And it took a couple of weeks for the kinks to get out of the system. We've run now, coming up will be our 3rd test with it, or analysis is a better way of saying it, with SGS. And that'll all be on our website as well.
What is the main driver of getting the oil out?
Let me show you an example.
Okay.
And it goes into the next topics.
It's an excellent question, Robert. Question I'll repeat. What is the main driver of why ethanol plants want to take oil out? It's all about money. What a surprise, huh? Here's an example of a U.S. scenario, and Steve can adjust these numbers based on Pannonia's situation. Let's take a 100 million gallon ethanol plant, which is one of our larger sizes of ethanol plants, but fairly common. That ethanol plant can invest about $3 million is what it costs to put in some centrifuges, some piping, some electrical stuff. It can be put right into an existing ethanol plant, no issues, no problems. So it generally involves a couple centrifuges. I already talked about that. From this investment, in this size plant, you can extract about 9 million kilograms of oil per year. And depending on the price of crude corn oil, or in this case it's known in the US as distiller's corn oil, and it's been somewhere in the, more recently it's been down in the 30-cent range, but it's been as high as 50 cents per pound, or somewhere in the $1 per kilogram range. Now you don't have to have a calculator, I don't think, but if you take 9 million kilograms times $1 per kilogram, you get $9 million a year for a $3 million investment. Your payback is a few months. How does it affect the price of DDGS, was the question.
It doesn't.
Does anybody want to take a guess? How does it affect the price of DDGS? Remain stable or increase? You're right. So here's where, going back to one of our earlier questions, protein should go up, but it doesn't necessarily. Here's another example. You take oil out, most people would say the price of DDGS should go down, right? It doesn't. It doesn't. Let me show you what's happened. And these are US prices.
While Jerry's looking at that, we were at a plant last week in the United States. It's been a very, very hard year for the ethanol facilities of North America. And the guy admitted to me, the plant manager, the only thing that kept them profitable last year was corn oil. The U.S. industry faces a lot of challenges, and so what they're trying to do is have as many possible revenue streams as they can.
U.S. prices. Steve can comment on how Hungarian prices fit this scenario. But earlier, most of you know, I made the comment, DDGS price follows the price of corn fairly closely. Not perfect, but closer than any other commodity. Historically in the U.S., DDGS was priced at about 75 to 80% the value of corn until about a year ago. And that price percentage started going up. Right now, DDGS price relative to corn price in the U.S. is about 130% the value of corn. Now, what's amazing about this is not only the huge reversal of DDGS now being worth more than corn, where it used to be worth less, but the other amazing thing is this all occurred in this last year when 85% of the ethanol industry has taken oil out. How can this be? There's been so much lack of supply globally of feed ingredients that it's put a lot of pressure on using stuff that people are paying more for than they might do so already. I would also argue, though, and I have real life examples of this. In fact, there's a company in the US that provides a service on sourcing and valuing DDGS for different animal markets. When DDGS price used to be 75 to 80% the value of corn, some of these sources or factories were giving up as much as $60 per short ton, US ton, in lost value compared to what its real feeding value was. So the price was low, but the actual economic value of its feeding value was much higher. So it's a great buy. But I think what's happened is because of this pressure on needing something to feed, this gap has narrowed some. So the ethanol plants now are getting more of that value captured, and the market kind of forced it, even though oil's coming out. I would agree with you that if we have abundant supply or an increased supply globally of feed ingredients, the protein-fat relationship probably is going to change. Yes?
Has there not been a big upsurge in the use of this as well in biodiesel production, and the margins in the States in biodiesel production has been particularly lucrative and more of a demand for this? Is that true? Or?
Yeah. The question, it's a good one. Most of the oil that's being extracted, or at least half of it, or well, more than half, is going into biodiesel production because there's a high demand and a growth occurring in biodiesel. But I'll also say that, and I want to come back to this question before I forget it about composition of corn oil. I'll also say that some of our major poultry integrators are now buying corn oil, distillers corn oil, in favor of what they used to buy of soybean oil or other vegetable oils. Tyson, for example, is buying a lot of distillers corn oil going into broiler diets. I know from recent trips to Asia, there are companies very, very interested in importing distillers corn oil for the same uses in broiler diets and so on. So I think it's an emerging kind of new undefined market. It'll be interesting to see how Pannonia and what your market develops into, but certainly corn oil is a very high energy, useful feed ingredient. The composition, the main factor that we worry about, and this is a key point on corn oil, I was going to get to that, but I'm glad we're here now. The main factor that you need to monitor in terms of quality of distillers corn oil is the free fatty acid content. Does anybody know why? Why would we worry about free fatty acids? I'm sorry? Rancidity, yes, to some extent. We know that if you have a lot of free fatty acids, they're vulnerable to rancidity or peroxidation. Most importantly, though, as the free fatty acid content of any animal fat or vegetable oil increases, the energy value for pigs or poultry decreases. So what's different about distillers corn oil, most of the ICM Fagan plants, design and processes, which are similar to Pannonia, are producing a distillers corn oil that's, well, it varies, but is between 8 to 12% free fatty acids. Occasionally, when these plants first start doing it, they can be up around 16 to 18% free fatty acids, depending on how they manage it. But most of it's around 10%. The best quality, or the lowest free fatty acid corn oil produced in the US today is by Poet, and their free fatty acid content is less than 5%. In fact, some of their plants are down around 1 or 2%. And so Pannonia's biggest US rival from a branding and competition point of view, which isn't really a market issue, is Poet. They have a brand called Voila, the Italian Voila, is what they're calling their corn oil. And it's very, very high quality and very much in demand for poultry feed. So I think we're going to see that kind of market develop here for Pannonia as well, primarily in poultry. As far as MIU, does everybody know MIU, moisture insolubles and unsaponifiables, kind of a quality measure, very commonly used. They're very, very acceptable in these sources. You will notice that distillers corn oil is a little cloudy in consistency or color. So there'll be some sediment that'll settle. Is that a concern? Probably not. Color is very, see if I can find a picture here. I'm going to skip way ahead. Here's the slide I was looking for earlier. If you, as a percentage, and these are US prices, spot prices in the Midwest, from February of 2011, and this only goes up to April of this year, see what's been happening to DDGS price, and this has been happening at the same time the ethanol industry has been taking oil out. So oil extraction has not resulted in a discount. It may eventually, but up to this point, it has not resulted in a discount in DDGS price.
Jerry, if we buy lower oil DDGs and all the trials which we make our decisions on are done on higher oil DDGs. So if we start using lower oil DDGs and all the trial work which we're making our decisions on to buy the DDGs have all been done on higher oils, are we in danger of misleading ourselves?
It keeps me in business. Did you hear the question? If all the research that I've been talking about today and that you see and you rely on is based on high oil DDGS, when you take some of the oil out, how does that affect what we can expect in terms of value or feeding value and so on? We have to redo all this stuff. The story's changed. And so we've already conducted 4 experiments in pigs, and I've been collaborating on some broiler studies as well, asking the question, how much does the energy value of DDGS get affected when you take oil out? Very quickly, no, let's just go right to it. I hope you're looking forward to the shock factor because we certainly didn't expect these results. Here's a study that Dr. Brian Kerr, one of my collaborators, and I just published earlier this year. Let me explain what this is. We collected 15 different sources of US DDGS. It ranged in oil content from about 5% up to about 13%. So kind of we were looking for a range. And what we did is we fed these different sources to growing pigs, measured how much energy they ate, how much they pooped and peed out. And by difference, we can calculate metabolizable energy. By the way, for those of you who have nutritionists or are nutritionists that formulate on a net energy basis, we have those values too. But at this point, we started with metabolizable energy. So, if our theory would have been correct, which it isn't, we should have seen a linear decrease in ME content as oil got taken out. It didn't happen. In fact, what's really interesting, you see this source over here? This one's a little bit over 5% oil. Look at the height of that bar, and let's go over, had the same energy values of 13%. So, my question for all of, how many of you are traders? Some of you I know are. Maybe you don't want to admit it. Okay. So, you've got customers. Dan's got some in Israel. And by the way, the story is the same for poultry. If the market was discounting DDGS because of oil content, then of course I would be interested in buying this source because I could pay less for it. And I know that it would give me more energy or as much energy as the higher oil one if the market was paying a premium for that. But the market so far has not differentiated based on oil content, at least relative to corn price. Maybe, I don't know what some of you negotiate, maybe it is a discount. My point is, if we have knowledge about our source, and if we know that this source is much higher in energy, if I can buy it cheaper, hey, that's a really good deal. My customer's happy because they're getting a lot of energy. Maybe I can buy it cheaper so I'm competitive. So this has changed, kind of turned the whole marketing of DDGS and the use of DDGS upside down and created lots of confusion and headaches for people. Our approach, my approach, to helping the industry, both ethanol and the feed industry, manage this challenge is we got to figure out how to predict the energy value regardless of oil content, right? I mean, that's one way to do it. So what we've done, and I don't want to bore you with all these things, but we've developed prediction equations where I can take a sample of DDGS from any source, send it to a commercial laboratory, measure the important things, and I'll define what these are in a moment, plug those values into the equation, and have a pretty accurate estimate of what the digestible or metabolizable energy is. We've got these equations now, and they're published for pigs and poultry. We don't have them for cattle. Go ahead.
Is there a readable version?
A readable version?
For regular people like myself to
For regular people?
This kind of equations?
Yes, I can help you with a readable version. I don't mean to scare people. Let me just define what these equations are. The numbers are straightforward, right? And then we are either adding or subtracting stuff, is what these equations tell us. The abbreviations are, I think, what's confusing. In both swine and poultry, for reduced oil or a range of low oil DDGS, the two most important predictors of energy value are gross energy, which we can determine by bomb calorimetry. It's very inexpensive. It's been used for years. However, most commercial labs don't provide that service, but they need to. So gross energy is the single most important factor, and of course that's measuring just the raw energy, has nothing to do with digestibility. So we need that measure for most of these equations. The second most important is some measure of fiber. So ADF is acid detergent fiber. People that deal with cattle know that term. TDF is total dietary fiber. We think that for pigs and poultry, it's a better fiber measure than NDF or ADF, and certainly it comes in favor of NDF and ADF in our equations. Sometimes NDF comes in. Everybody knows ash, right? Ash is the minerals that are left over after you burn something. Here's an example of bulk density. And by the way, if you're writing all these down, that's fine, but I'd be happy to make your life easier, because we've actually taken these developed equations and gone through a validation process where we fed these sources to pigs, and we're doing the same thing for poultry to make sure that they predict really accurately and precisely. So we've narrowed this long list down to really one equation. And I could give that to you, or I'll provide it to Steve and he can pass it along. So don't worry about copying all these down. The point is there's a lot of stuff that goes into helping the industry figure this out. Notice that in only a couple of cases, look for the term EE. That stands for ether extract. Does anybody know what ether extract measures? Fat, oil. So if it appears, it's usually the third or less important measurement compared to gross energy and fiber. And it doesn't happen in very many of those equations. So the very first time I presented these results to the pig and feed industry in the US was in Des Moines 2 years ago. We had about 250 people there from all the integrators and so on. And the title of my presentation, which everybody thought was really silly at the time, Reduced Oil DDGS. It's not the fat, it's the fiber. It's kind of a little slogan to remember the message. Oil content is a very poor predictor of energy value of DDGS. As scientists, we use things like R squared. All I have to tell you is that if you have an R square of 1, there's a really good association, and if it's 0, there's no relationship. If I relate corn oil content to ME or net energy value, the R square is close to 0. Really low, not very predictive. That makes everybody angry because most people say, just tell me, Dr. Shearson, just tell me how much a 1% reduction in oil means to energy content. I can't, because that relationship doesn't exist.
Excuse me, can I just...
Please.
Oh, thank you. If you'd be kind enough just to flip the equations back onto the screen.
Sure.
I'm a nutritionist, so I'm not a trader, so I like equations. And I take your point about ether extract not predominantly in all the equations. Now, scientifically, you want a big R squared, because that explains most of the variation. 1 is great.
Right.
So your DE1 at the top, R squared is 0.91, so that's really good. But it's got gross energy in the calculation. And as oil has over twice the gross energy of the rest of the feed, it is indirectly correlated.
They're confounded.
Indirectly correlated, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
And if you look at the poultry one, which I think is the ME line, you've got ether extract in there with a strong positive multiplier.
Right.
So I think there is a strong correlation. And I take your point, 100% variation between sources. Oil is not a consistent pattern. But I think here today we're talking about a specific source, an excellent source of distillers, where a decision has been made to extract some of the oil for some great commercial reasons. So if the process doesn't change in terms of maintaining digestibility, numerically less oil will be in there. So the gross energy has, the pig and poultry energy has to come down. It's just mathematics.
Thank you for your points. And they're very good, and I agree with what you're saying. I didn't include the actual regression lines where we regressed DE and ME with oil content, but the R square is really low. And I appreciate your comment that gross energy is measured and does decrease when you take oil out. It has to. One of the reasons that I think measuring ether extract or crude fat is not helping us with predicting energy very well is the result of two important studies, at least two. One, the University of Illinois just published a study where they compared the digestibility, total tract digestibility and ileal digestibility of lipid in DDGS versus extracted corn oil that was added back. Which one do you think had the highest digestibility? The one that was intact in DDGS or the extracted that they added back on top of it? The extracted did. Digestibility of the extracted oil was about 90%. The digestibility of the oil in the DDGS was about 55%. When we think about ingredients and we measure ether extract or crude fat and it says 10%, many of us might think, oh, all of that's digestible, all of that's going into energy. We know that's not the case. So what's remaining in DDGS as oil, we think is bound up in the fiber matrix, not very accessible to digestive enzymes, and as a result, it's not contributing much to energy, even though it's there, even though we can measure it in the laboratory. The second point, at least in pigs, we know that fiber digestibility of DDGS, and this is total dietary fiber, total tract digestibility, ranges from about 25% in some sources to over 55% in other sources. How can this be? Corn fiber should be corn fiber. We don't understand it. We don't, in fact, I argue, we don't understand fiber very well in monogastric nutrition. We're trying to learn more about it. The point is, there are some factors that I think help us explain why this relationship is not as predictable as we think it is or should be. And I think those are two reasons. Are there some other questions?
Yeah, on a totally different topic. What would be the next extraction you would foresee? So now we have oil. Would that be a path going down yeast or maybe even the fibers? And what would be the implication for the nutritional value of the DGS?
It's a very good question. I know some of you probably have more questions about this energy issue, and we can talk about that. I do want to spend a little time on your question about some of the changes or the new technologies that are being considered and in some cases implemented in the ethanol industry in the U.S. We could talk about a lot of things, Rob, but I do want to at least focus on some of the points on this slide because I think they give a general picture of what's happening in the U.S. ethanol industry. First of all, from an economics point of view, because money drives many of the things that we do, most of the things we do, co-products represent an increasing proportion of total revenue of U.S. ethanol plants. Now that represents about 20 to 25%. That number probably will get bigger depending on the corn oil market. So it's pretty significant. And this has occurred about the same time that profit margins for ethanol have been going down. So the reliance on co-products has sort of changed the mindset and the way ethanol plant owners and managers think about their business. And so one of the things to remember is that U.S. ethanol plants are evolving into what I call the next generation. And that next generation is biorefineries, where they're going to continue to take more stuff, high-value things, out of the co-products. Some of those will be branded. Some of those will have very unique properties. Some will have specific market applications. And I think we're going to see less commodity DDGS and more specialized ethanol co-products. I'll show you some examples in a moment. So movement away from commodity co-products to specialized markets. Distillers corn oil is an obvious example. We've been talking about that. Yes, a lot of this is still going to go into animal feeds. Industrial applications are being looked at. Bioplastics. The syrup or the condensed solubles makes really good bioplastics. Is that the best value or application? Depends on the market, depends on the situation. we're actually doing, one of my colleagues and I are spending a fair bit of time looking at the special chemicals in corn and corn co-products. I've got some examples toward the end. We're probably not going to have time to get into it, but there are some unique properties that if we can harvest or extract those valuable chemicals, they can go into very high value human health applications, animal applications, and so on. So there's a lot of interest in this. Here's some examples. There are some new yeast strains that do improve ethanol yield, and in doing so, they probably slightly alter the nutrient composition of DDGS. We have two companies that I know of in the US that are working with existing ethanol plants, converting them from ethanol into isobutanol production. One company is Gevo, another one is a joint venture between British Petroleum and DuPont called Butamax. Some of you may have read about them. They're in the very beginning stages, but those processes, and I work a lot with Butamax, those processes significantly alter the composition of the co-products. So somebody asked, so what happens now when we take oil out of DDGS and have reduced oil distillers? Can we use the old research? No. But think about all these changes in co-products. All these have to be evaluated too to help folks like you figure out how much can I use, what are the risks, what are the benefits, how should I value it? All those kinds of questions need to be redone every time these new co-products come out. It makes me happy because it keeps me in business as a researcher, but we have to be more proactive and find funding to be able to do these kind of things. Steve, what kind of things are you planning, or your management team planning with Pannonia?
Well, before I answer that, specifically we were talking about the oil. And it's interesting because the aquaculture guys are wild about this product without oil now. I'm not enough of a nutritionist to really understand why, but combined with the fact that we're a single source facility and that we're going to be replacing some of their more traditional ingredients like fish meal and fish oil, which are generally going for about $1,000 the metric ton, I think what you can see is we're going to be competition not just within the feed industry for our products, but across new industries. What are we doing? We're a U.S. plant. We are basically a piece of Iowa located in Tolna County, Hungary. And hence, everything that goes on in North America we watch very closely. We have the benefit of 90 plants by the same the same technology company as ourselves, doing research on these various things. So we sit, we wait, we look at what happens, and then we try to take what is the best. Corn oil. Rob asked me, why did we wait for corn oil? Well, we wanted to see how it worked out. We've seen up there second generation issues. Same thing, we can let the Department of Energy in the United States fund all that research. We sit back and wait, and then it bolts onto our facility. So everything that Jerry's brought up there, our technical team's already looking at. And it's just going to be a question of, does it make sense economically or not?
I mentioned new yeast strains are coming into being. Some of these are genetically modified, but they're going into ethanol plants. It's going to change the conversion of carbohydrate to ethanol, so it'll alter the composition. I've already mentioned isobutanol. Some existing ethanol plants are implementing that technology. Cellulosic is coming. It's not there yet. I can tell you as a real live example of sort of the cellulosic thing that's coming into play. There's an ethanol plant in northeast Iowa, not far from my home state of Minnesota. And they are going to be taking the corn fiber and putting that through ethanol production. And the result will be a low oil, because they're pulling oil out too. So they're going to have a low oil, low fiber, high protein DDGS. It's not really DDGS anymore, it's something else, but for lack of a... So you're going to see these different combinations. So the world's going to get a lot more interesting. The protein is, that's a good question. Protein content, as I recall, is about 40 to 42%. And it's primarily a function of how much oil is going to remain. If they take down to 1%, which is difficult, 3% is probably going to be the oil content. Protein will be a little over 40, 42, and low fiber. That's only one plant. There may be others. We don't know. It's an example. Some ethanol companies, at least I know of one, that's reconsidering front-end fractionation. Some of you that have followed the U.S. ethanol co-products over the years probably can identify things like high-protein DDGS, which was common. Some were pulling the germ out, producing a de-oiled, that was a 3% oil DDGS at the time. An old company called Verisun was doing some of that. So there are some companies that are going back to this because the economics and business dynamics have changed from the day that some of these plants put this system in and found out that it didn't work so well. Plus technologies have changed. We're going to see co-product blends. ADM, for example, does a lot of this domestically because they have both wet mills and dry grind plants, and they're taking different extractives and combinations and knowing the nutrient profile, producing cattle supplements to merchandise and find more value in some of the co-products they're producing. We're going to see more brands. I think we're going to see compounds like value enhancers. There's a company in Germany that I'm spending some time with. It's an enzyme company that's actually developed technology to break down more of the fiber post-fermentation in DDGS, and they're conducting poultry studies primarily, and they're seeing about a 200 to 250 kcal per kilogram of AME increase by simply using that technology. That's really attractive because if we're going to keep taking oil out of DDGS, eventually we're going to reduce the energy to some extent. So finding ways to utilize the fiber better in a species like chickens that don't have much fermentation and can't use fiber very well, it's a really valuable technology. So we're going to start seeing some of those things come into play. Dried yeast co-product, a lot of people have interest in this. High protein, yeast as a protein source is really attractive to us nutritionists. Amino acid profile is good, digestibility is high, and there's a lot of interest in extracting the residual yeast or the spent yeast and making it into a high-value co-product. There's some researchers at a university south of us called Iowa State University that have been playing around and trying to commercialize another technology where they take the thin stillage, this is the 7 to 8% dry matter liquid after the ethanol has been extracted. It's actually the liquid where the corn oil is being extracted as well. But they're using it as a feed source, a nutrient source, to grow fungi, or molds, specific molds, to produce a high protein, high digestible amino acid protein source. They're calling it mycomeal. So it's a co-product produced by fungi, and by the way, you don't have to worry about mycotoxins. It's the wrong kind of fungus. But these things are happening, and the protein content, I've seen the specs, it's about the same as soybean meal. It's very attractive. Lots of other things are happening as well. I've got about 5 minutes left, and I promised Steve that I would talk about wet distillers grains, so I want to do that. But let me just say that we're playing around with other interesting things such as ferulic acid. I don't have time to talk about it. It's naturally high in corn. It's a powerful antioxidant. We've been doing studies with rats as models, looking at atherosclerosis or heart disease and an ability of this compound to prevent it. It works quite well. These are what the mice look like that we feed sometimes. So I'm not just a pig guy, I play with mice and rats sometimes too. But xanthophylls we've talked about, they have some human health benefits. We're seeing some reductions in atherosclerotic lesions by using some of these corn co-products. And I think we're going to see a lot more variety and different kinds of things that are going to come out of these now ethanol biorefineries. Let me just jump and make a few comments on wet distillers grains. Wet distillers grains is going to be a new version of co-product availability out of Pannonia ethanol. And for the most part, when you make dry matter adjustments on nutrient content, the nutrient profile looks the same as dry. The real advantages, as I mentioned earlier, is that the energy value for cattle is higher than DDGS and certainly higher than corn. Plus, the ethanol plant doesn't have to run the dryer as much. And so they win too. So there are some advantages. Generally speaking in the US, and this has been the predominant form of DDGS fed for decades, and most of it's gone to cattle feeders. And I mentioned earlier that many of our ethanol plants were purposely built in cattle feeding areas located next to corn. So there's a lot of synergy. The basic idea is you don't want to transport water very far because water isn't worth much. So you have a lower cost per unit of dry matter, eliminates drying cost, higher energy content. It does mix very well in a total mixed ration. And it does help reduce diet sorting. Here's a picture of a farmer standing next to a pile of wet distillers grains, which is about 35% dry matter in a bunker, and it works quite well. Energy content, as I mentioned, these are just a summary of some of the studies. You can see that some of these are showing 150%, some are around 100%, depending on the study, the conditions of net energy for cattle relative to corn. So what are the disadvantages? It's wet. We need to use preservatives if we're going to store it for any length of time, especially during warm temperatures of the summer. If not, we end up with spoilage. And that can be a bad thing because fat content is affected. To some extent, some other nutrients are affected as well. What's interesting, and I don't have time to get into details, but there have been some studies done, actually several, asking the question, does spoilage of wet distillers grains affect cattle performance? Most of us would think if I feed spoiled feed, growth rate, feed conversion gets worse. Surprisingly, because the rumen of the cattle is so tolerant of so many bad things that we put into it, that the studies universally have shown really no negative effects. But we do lose nutrients and we have other issues. So the preferred method, of course, is to use preservatives if we're going to store it for a long period of time. Or if you're close to the ethanol plant, you get regular shipments every day, every couple days, depending on the number of cattle you're feeding and so on. So transportation costs are something we have to factor in. And they vary, of course, based on what country you're in. Higher storage costs per unit of dry matter because you're storing a lot of water. Lower concentrations of bypass protein or RUP, which depending on your perspective as a ruminant nutritionist may be good or maybe not so good. Poor storage stability, and the diet may contain too much moisture, especially if you're using corn silage or other high moisture forages. We can lose wet distillers grains because we're generally storing it outdoors. Many factors affect it. Storage issues, probably let me just finish up. Because some of you that have experience on dairy or beef farms are using plastic bags like these? Okay. So what you might expect, because it's a high liquid material, if you try to put it in a plastic bag, it kind of gets flat because water is very dense. But most of our operations in the US will bag it using forages, whatever you have locally available, generally a grass hay, and here's some bagged distillers grains, so it holds up very nicely when you blend the forage with the wet material. Here's storing it with 40% grass hay in a concrete bunker. so it gives it some shape. And here is the recipe, so to speak, depending on what forage you have available. If I'm using wet distiller's grains with solubles or modified wet, which the only difference is a little higher dry matter content, I can use wheat straw, corn stalks, grass hay. These are the common forages used in the US. And depending on if you're storing it in a plastic bag or a bunker, these are kind of the ratios or the recommendations of mixing that forage with the wet distiller's grains to have a nice composition of material that stores well. Minimizing spoilage, one of the questions I know came up last week was what kind of preservatives are recommended. From all the research that's been done at Nebraska and our university at Minnesota, propionic acid works fine at a rate of about 0.5 to 1 kilogram per ton is the addition. Various companies, I'm using Chemin as one example. They have a product called Myco-Curb, can work fine. There are some others that work equally as well. You know those products probably better than I do. If not, I'm sure Steve and his technical team can help put you in touch with companies that provide those kinds of products. Chemin has an office here in Budapest. It's not an advertisement for them necessarily, but they're a company that's been in the business for a long time. So we need to mix it. I just put in some slides of some common mixer issues that we run into sometimes, not related to wet distiller's grains, but related to managing forages in general. We're trying to avoid sorting of ingredients, and certainly using wet distiller's grains helps with that. Feeding value, again, our cattle feedlots in particular and some of our dairies are using it primarily as an energy source, so we're overfeeding protein and phosphorus. And as you might expect, wet distiller's grains gives us the same kind of performance responses that we get for dry. In fact, feed efficiency is actually better because it's got more energy.